It's 11:43 at night. You're lying in bed, staring at the ceiling after another argument. Earlier today, you told yourself, if this happens one more time, I'm done. But now they're asleep beside you. They apologized. They promised things would be different. And somehow, you're already wondering if maybe you were too hard on them. Tomorrow, you'll wake up exhausted. Not because you didn't sleep, but because your heart and your mind spent the entire night arguing with each other. If this feels familiar, today's episode is for you.
Welcome to Nerdy Psychology. Break it down with a little curiosity. So be curious, stay kind, keep your mind nerdy.
Hi, psychology nerds. I'm Dr. Angel, and this is Nerdy Psychology, where we look at the real, messy, deeply human experiences of life through a science-based psychology lens. And today, we're talking about something tender. Why it can be hard to leave toxic relationship. So we're going to take this slowly with compassion, curiosity, and no shame. The question we keep asking. There's a question I have heard more times than almost any other question in my career, and it usually comes from someone standing on the outside, looking in with love and fear all tangled together. Maybe it's a sister watching her brother get smaller in a relationship, or a best friend who's watched 3 apologies too many, a parent who lies awake at night the way their child does. And maybe you asked it. Maybe someone has asked you about it. Maybe you've whispered it to yourself. The question is always some version of, why don't they just leave? And I want to be honest with you about something before we go any further. That question, even when it does come from love, does something quiet and corrosive. It puts the weight of the problem on the person being hurt instead on the dynamic that's actually hurting them. It implies that staying is a failure of willpower or intelligence or self-respect, when the truth is almost always more complicated and far more human than that. So today, we're not going to ask, why don't they leave? We're going to ask a better question. What is actually happening inside a person's mind and body that makes leaving so much harder than it looks from the outside? Because once you understand the psychology, why don't they just leave? Stop sounding like a mystery. It starts sounding like the most natural response in the world to an incredibly unnatural situation. By the end of today's episode, my hope isn't that you'll decide whether to leave or stay. My hope is that you'll begin trusting yourself again. The battle between your head and your heart. Here's something I say often in my practice. You're not one mind. You're a very real neurological sense of at least 2. Imagine your brain has 2 advisors sitting at the same table. One advisor brings spreadsheets and the other one brings memories. One says, this isn't healthy. The other says, but remember our anniversary? There's the part of you that thinks in logic, it weighs evidence, it makes lists, it can look at a relationship on paper, the broken promises, the patterns, the math of it all, and say, clearly, this is not safe, this is not healthy, this needs to end. Then there's the part of you that feels, and it doesn't care about the list. It cares about the way their hand felt on your back during the good years. It cares about the version of them you fell in love with, the one who still shows up sometimes, just often enough to matter. It doesn't recalculate, it remembers, and it hopes. Neuroscience actually gives us language for this. Your prefrontal cortex, that part of your brain that plans, reasons, and weighs long-term consequences, is doing that list making. But your limbic system, that older, faster, more emotional part of your brain, is running the hope. And here's the part almost nobody tells you. Under chronic stress, your limbic system doesn't quiet down. It gets louder. It's built for survival, not clarity. And when your nervous system has spent months or years bracing for the next conflict. It starts making decisions your rational brain doesn't even get a chance to vote on. This is not a character flaw. This is architecture. You were never fighting a lack of willpower. You're fighting your own wiring that ironically is trying to protect you. Hope, our greatest strength, and sometimes our greatest trap. I want to talk about hope for a moment because I think we've done hope a disservice in, well, how we talk about it. Hope is not naive. Hope is one of the most powerful psychological resources a human being has. It's the thing that gets people through illnesses, through grief, through the kinds of days that shouldn't be survivable, but somehow are. I would never, ever tell you to stop hoping, but hope has a shadow side. And I want to give it a name because once something has a name, you can finally see it clearly. I call it the relationship time machine. And here's how it works. In a difficult relationship, your mind doesn't just live in the present moment. It quietly builds a time machine. It transports you back to the early days, the version of them before things got hard, the laugh that used to be easy, the way they used to look at you. And it holds that memory up next to who they are now. And it whispers, that person is still there. And if you just hold on a little longer, you're going to get them back. The relationship time machine feels like hope. But notice what it's actually doing. It's asking you to make decisions about your present based on a person who, in some cases, may no longer exist. You're not staying for who they are. You're staying for who they were and quietly hoping the present will eventually catch up to the past. There's a second mechanism I want to name, and it's one that's just as sneaky, and I call it borrowing hope. This is what happens after every apology, after every promise, every I'll go back to therapy or things will be different. In that moment, you don't just feel relief. You take out a loan. You borrow enough hope to get through the next stretch of hard days. And like any loan, it comes due. When the pattern repeats, and in the unaddressed toxic dynamics, it usually does, you're not just disappointed, you're now in emotional debt. And the interest is your own trust and your judgment. That is why leaving a toxic relationship rarely feels like one decision. It feels like defaulting on a loan you've been paying into for months or years. And grief has a way of making even bad debts feel sacred. The psychology that keeps us stuck. Let's get nerdy for a moment because I don't want you to just feel understood. I want you to understand the mechanics. Once you can see the gears turning, they can loosen some of that grip. Intermittent reinforcement, what we call the slot machine effect. If a relationship were consistently bad, well, leaving would actually be easier. Consistency, even painful consistency, is at least predictable. The mind can plan around it, but most toxic relationships aren't consistently bad. They're unpredictable. Good days, bad days, sometimes wonderful days, sandwiched right in between even some of the worst days. This is psychologically the exact same mechanism that makes the slot machine so much more addictive than the vending machine. A vending machine gives you what you paid for every time, predictable, so nobody gets obsessed with it. A slot machine pays out just often enough, just unpredictably enough that your brain keeps pulling the lever, certain that the next pull might be the big one. Behavioral psychologists have known this for decades, that the intermittent reinforcement produces the strongest, most persistent behavior patterns of any reward schedule we've studied. Stronger than reward every single time. Your brain isn't broken for staying hooked on an unpredictable relationship. It's responding exactly the way reward circuitry is built to respond. Trauma bonding. Layered onto that cycle of tension and conflict, then relief or reconciliation, repeated over time, and you get what's known as trauma bonding. It's a real documented attachment that forms specifically because of the cycle of harm and repair, not despite it. The nervous system attaches most fiercely, not to safety, but to relief from fear. That is a profoundly uncomfortable thing to sit with, but understanding it takes away so much shame. Not every toxic relationships creates this trauma bond, but when it does, it can be very, very powerful. Attachment. Our greatest relationships teach us what love is supposed to feel like. And for many people, especially those who grew up in unpredictable or emotionally inconsistent homes, love was never supposed to feel calm. It was supposed to feel like effortful and uncertain, something you had to earn back. If chaos was your first language of love, calm can actually feel unfamiliar, even suspicious. And some people describe healthy relationships when they finally experience one as feeling boring. That's not coincidence. That's attachment history talking. Cognitive dissonance. This is the psychological discomfort of holding two conflicting beliefs at once. I love this person, and this person is hurting me. The mind doesn't like holding that tension, so it looks for ways to resolve it. It's often easier to minimize the harm. It really wasn't that bad, or maybe I just overreacted, than to fully accept both sides at once. This isn't weakness, it's your mind trying to protect itself from this unbearable contradiction. Then there's the sunken cost fallacy. The years you've already invested don't just represent time, they represent identity. The wedding you planned, the family you built, the future you told your friends and family about. And leaving doesn't just mean leaving a person, it can mean grieving a future you already believed was real and admitting publicly that the investment didn't pay off the way you'd hope. That is one of the most difficult admissions a human being can make, and it has nothing to do with intelligence or strength. Identity erosion. And finally, the quietest one, and in many ways the most dangerous. Slowly over time in a toxic dynamic, you stop recognizing your own preferences, your own opinions, your own reactions. You stop ordering what you want at restaurants. You check their face before speaking. You apologize before, well, you even know why. Tiny moments, huge impacts. You start filtering everything through their perspective before you even notice you're doing it. This isn't dramatic, it's gradual, which is exactly what makes it so hard to see from the inside. By the time many people ask, why don't they just leave? The person being asked may no longer have full access to the self that would need to make that decision. Take all 6 of these, the slot machine, the trauma bond, the attachment wire, and the dissonance, and the sunken cost, and the erosion of self, and stack them on top of each other. Because that's not a person who's weak. That's a person who's carrying an extraordinary psychological weight, often completely alone, often while still going to work and parenting and smiling in photos. And if you've been there, I want you to hear this clearly. None of this was a failure of your character. It was your mind doing exactly what minds do under this kind of pressure. So, how do you begin finding yourself? So, where does this leave us? Well, not in hopelessness. I promise you that's not where we're headed. It leaves us with tools, real usable tools. 1, externalize the pattern. Write down what actually happened, not how it felt in the moment, but the timeline of events in plain language, as if you were describing it to a stranger. This interrupts that relationship time machine because it's much more difficult to time travel to the golden memory when you're looking directly out at a dated factual report of what actually occurred. 2, notice when you're borrowing hope. Next time you feel that rush of relief after an apology or a promise, name it out loud. I am borrowing hope right now. You don't have to reject the hope. You just have to see it clearly enough to remember that it will eventually come due, and to ask yourself in advance what you'll do when it does. 3, rebuild decision-making self, one small choice at a time. Identity erosion happens gradually, so rebuilding happens gradually too. Start building with really small things. What do you want for dinner? What show do you really want to watch? What you think about something that doesn't really matter much. Every one of these tiny, unfiltered choices is a rep in the gym of reclaiming your voice. 4, Build a witness, not just a support system. Find at least one person that you trust enough to tell the whole truth to. Not the polished version, not the version that makes sense of it for other people, but the real version. Trauma and cognitive dissonance thrive in isolation and silence. A witness, somebody who reflects reality back to you when your own mind is understandably clouded, is one of the most protective factors that we know of. 5, redefine what calm is supposed to feel like. If your nervous system learned that love means intensity, gently and patiently teach it a new definition. Seek out in friendships, in therapy, in small daily moments, the specific feeling of consistency. At first, it's going to feel unfamiliar and even unfamiliar to the point of boredom. And that discomfort is not a red flag. It's often the sound of your nervous system recalibrating to something healthier than it's ever known. Maureen stayed in a relationship for 6 years that from the outside looked confusing to everybody who loved her. She was sharp, successful, the kind of person that assumed would just know better. But Maureen wasn't missing information. She was carrying every single mechanism that we just talked about all at once, and she didn't have any language for it. What changed wasn't this dramatic final straw. It was way smaller than that. She started writing down what actually happened, plainly after each hard night, not to build a case against anyone, just to see it more clearly. Weeks in, she read it back to herself and said something I'll never forget. I've been living inside a story I kept editing to make it kinder than it was. That sentence was the beginning, not the end. The beginning. It took her another year of small, unglamorous choices, 100 of tiny dinners where she finally chose what she wanted before she left. And when she did, it wasn't with this dramatic clarity she'd always imagined leaving would feel like. It was quiet. It was tired. It was, in her words, less like escaping and more like finally exhaling. And that's usually what healing actually looks like, not this cinematic door slam, an exhale. If any part of today's episode feels like it's describing something that you're living through, the fog, the hope, the exhaustion of arguing with your own heart, I've built my workbook, Your Next Chapter, for exactly this kind of moment. It's a guided space for the work we've talked about today. Externalizing your story, rebuilding your decision-making voice, and slowly, gently finding your way back to yourself. You can find it linked in the description below if you're interested. So let's go back to that question we started with. Why don't they just leave? I hope by now it sounds different to you than it did 20 minutes ago, because the truth is, staying was never the mystery. The mystery was how anyone finds the strength to leave it all, carrying a slot machine in their chest and a time machine in their memory, and a version of themselves that's been slowly going quiet for years. If you're the one lying awake at 11:43 tonight, arguing with your own heart, I want you to hear this clearly without shame attached to a single word of it. Hope isn't the problem. Hope without evidence is. Maybe today isn't the day you leave. Maybe today is simply the day you stop calling the pain normal. Maybe it's the day you tell one trusted person the whole story. Maybe it's the day you begin writing down what actually happened. Healing rarely begins with one giant leap. It usually begins with one honest moment. If today's episode resonated with you, I think you're going to want to watch this next. That Never Happened. Understanding gaslighting. Because once you can see the psychological mechanisms that keep you hoping, the next question is almost always, what happens when someone starts rewriting your reality along the way? And as always, be curious, stay kind, and keep your mind nerdy. See you Friday. That's a wrap.
Be curious, stay kind, keep your mind